Hey there, everybody. This is Taliesin, and today I'd like to talk about an urban legend that's been floating around the occult and pagan communities pretty much since the dawn of modern paganism. And that urban legend is that not only did Gerald Gardner pay Aleister Crowley to write the Gardnerian rituals for him, but there was even a Gardnerian Book of Shadows in Aleister Crowley's handwriting on display at Gerald Gardner's Museum of Witchcraft and Magic on the Isle of Mann. Now, the idea that Gerald Gardner had Crowley write the rituals for him is a little understandable, especially when you consider that this urban legend got started back before we knew a whole lot of exactly what was in the Gardnerian rituals or Book of Shadows and how those things came to be. Now, when Gerald Gardner first decided to set up what would become the first Gardnerian coven, he took the rituals and practices that he'd been given by the New Forest coven that initiated him and tried to flesh them out, tried to fill them out into something that you could teach to people who didn't happen to have a lifetime of ceremonial magic and occultism behind them. And he used a lot of Crowley material to do this. Now, Crowley was one of the preeminent ritual magicians of the era, so it's easy to understand why somebody would go to Crowley's stuff to borrow bits and pieces here and there when they're trying to come up with a ritual system. However, Gardner didn't pay Crowley to write the Gardnerian rituals. He just stole a lot of Crowley's stuff to stick into the early Gardnerian rituals. As a matter of fact, this is how Doreen Valiente wound up writing so much stuff in the Gardnerian Book of Shadows, because when she was in a ritual with Gardner, she noticed all the bits of Crowley in there. And she pointed this out to Gerald after the ritual was done. And Gerald wasn't really all that happy initially that somebody had noticed just how much he had ripped off of Crowley. And furthermore, Doreen said that while she thought that some of it worked, other bits of it just really didn't fit this kind of goddess centered, fertility worshiping type of cult that Gerald Gardner was trying to put together. So Gardner looked at Doreen and said, "Well, my dear, if you think you can do better, then by all means, go ahead and do it." And that's what she did. And we got things like the Witch's Rune and the Charge of the Goddess and all of other kinds of great stuff. But Gardner was a fan of Crowley's. As a matter of fact, Gerald Gardner paid Aleister Crowley a considerable amount of money to buy a charter to run a lodge of the OTO, Crowley's Magical Order, from Aleister Crowley in the last few months of his life. Crowley did meet with Gardner. We know this because Crowley noted it in his diaries, where he kept meticulous track of every single person he met with every single day. And it's well known that Gardner did pay the money for the OTO charter. Now, this is where the story of a Gardnerian Book of Shadows in Aleister Crowley's handwriting comes from. And it's very, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating how real life events wind up giving birth to urban legends that aren't exactly accurate. Here's the story of the Book of Shadows in Aleister Crowley's handwriting. Now, when Gerald decided to buy the OTO charter off of Crowley, he ran into a little bit of a conflict in the way that Gardner versus Crowley approached things like charters and fancy pieces of paper. Uh, Gardner was a fan of fancy pieces of paper, and Crowley wasn't. In Aleister Crowley's mind, if you had his permission or his authority to do something, that's all you needed. You didn't need any fancy documents or any sort of written rule book signed by the master. If Crowley said, "You have my permission to do it," you go do it. Well, Gardner, on the other hand, was a fan of charters. He was a fan of fancy pieces of paper. And so he asked Crowley for a handwritten charter. Now, Gerald had given Crowley a lot of money. So Crowley was a little predisposed to say, "Go ahead, I'll humor you, old man. I will go ahead and write you out a charter." So Crowley tore a piece of paper out of a notebook and used a ballpoint pen to write out a charter for the OTO for Gerald Gardner. Now, this didn't really satisfy Gerald's desire for fancy and ornate pieces of paper. So what Gardner did is he took that charter home and decided to redo it himself. He got a piece of paper out of a very old book. I think it was from the 1800s. I believe it was a shipping registry, and something where one side of it was blank. And Gardner sat down and rewrote the charter that Crowley had written for him, leaving a space blank for Crowley to sign his name and put his seal. Now we know that Gerald Gardner wrote this particular document for two reasons. One, it's got a lot of spelling errors. As a matter of fact, even the Law of Thelema is wrong on it. The wording's not right. And Gerald Gardner had taught himself how to read, so he had atrocious spelling. As a matter of fact, all of Gardner's books were edited by far more competent writers in order to get them ready for publication because his spelling was just so bad. He never had any formal schooling. He taught himself to read, so I think he did pretty well publishing as many books that he did. But Gardner also, we know that Gardner also wrote the particular charter that he treasured so much because it was in his very distinctive, his own distinctive calligraphy. Gerald Gardner had a very fancy, swooping calligraphic hand when he wanted to. I mean, the guy's own handwriting was also pretty atrocious, but when he'd actually sit down with pen and ink and decide, I'm going to write something that's very neat and tidy, he could do it. It was a very distinctive, sweeping calligraphic hand. I've seen multiple instances of Gerald Gardner's calligraphy over the years, and once you see it, you recognize it. So he wrote this charter out, leaving a space for Crowley's name and his seal, and brought it back, and Crowley humored him. He signed it, he sealed it, and then Gardner framed this OTO charter from Aleister Crowley, or written by Aleister Crowley but recopied by Gerald Gardner. He framed it and hung it up in a case in his Witchcraft Museum on the Isle of Mann. And the little placard next to it said this was an OTO charter granted to Gerald Brousseau Gardner by Aleister Crowley to run an OTO lodge. Now the funny thing is that in that Witchcraft Museum, in another case just a few feet away from the case that had the Aleister Crowley OTO charter, written out by Gerald Gardner, was a case that had one of Gerald Gardner's books of shadows in it. It was open to a non-ritual passage, so he wasn't divulging any of the oath-bound rituals that was in the Book of Shadows. And also, one thing about Gardner's calligraphy, it was really big. I mean, really big, swooping letters. And so, even though it had a non-ritual passage that it was open to, it was there weren't a whole lot of words in there, so he really wasn't giving a whole lot away. But the interesting thing is that the Book of Shadows was written in Gardner's very distinctive calligraphy. Just a few feet away, the OTO charter, also in Gerald Gardner's very distinctive calligraphy, was displayed in another case. Now, the Book of Shadows, who wrote it wasn't given. It just said, this is a witch's Book of Shadows. It didn't say that Gardner had handwritten it himself. So when people would go to the Witchcraft Museum, in one case, they'd see a charter that was purported to be from Aleister Crowley for an OTO lodge, and just a few feet away, there'd be a Gardnerian Book of Shadows in the exact same handwriting as the charter. And since the charter said it was from Crowley and the Book of Shadows was uncredited, people assumed that Crowley wrote both. You could tell that the same person had written both of them because they were in the exact same handwriting. And so that's where the story of a Gardnerian Book of Shadows and Aleister Crowley's handwriting came from. People looked at both and they assumed that since Crowley had written the charter, he must have also written that Book of Shadows, when in fact it was Gerald Gardner who had written both of them. Such is the way that magical legends are born. That's it for me right now. I ask you to please like and subscribe. If you like this video, I'm going to be doing hopefully fairly regular videos on all kinds of manner of witchcraft and Wiccan and pagan topics coming up here. And you're going to hear a lot about Wiccan history because I love it. But however, blessed be and stuff, and you guys have a great day.